It was Wyoming, 1884, and the wind had a way of scouring a person down to the bone. It planed the color from the clapboard of the house, bleached the fence posts pale as old bone, and worked its way through the seams of a man's coat until it found the loneliness he carried inside him. The land itself was a hard master, all high plains and distant, saw-toothed mountains that held onto the last of the winter snow like a bitter memory. This was a place that did not offer second chances easily. It demanded proof of worthiness first, paid in sweat and calluses, and the quiet fortitude of a spirit that refused to break. Elara Calloway knew the language of this land. She had been born to it. She understood the thin rustle of the dry grass that meant a long summer, the particular gray of a sky that promised a blizzard, not just a storm. For 6 months, since her father had been laid to rest on the small rise overlooking the creek, she had been speaking the language alone. The ranch was her only inheritance, a spread of good grazing land, a sturdy if weathered house, and a corral full of wild mustangs her father had sworn would be their fortune. Now they were just another mouth to feed, another problem in a long, silent tally of them. She was tall for a woman, with a plain, honest face and hands that were raw at the knuckles from work they were not accustomed to. Her father had been the strength, she the quiet organizer. Now she had to be both, and the weight of it was a physical thing, settling in her shoulders each morning when she woke in the cold house. The silence was the worst part. A house built for a family held a particular kind of echo when only one person walked its floors. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house, a quiet and constant companion at the supper table. The man who rode in from the east did so without fanfare. He did not hail the house from a distance. He simply appeared at the edge of her property line, a solitary figure on a tired-looking sorrel, and rode steadily toward the house as if he had an appointment. He was a man made of straight lines and angles, lean in the way of men who have missed more meals than they have eaten. His coat was a worn brown, the cuffs frayed, and his hat was stained with the dust of a dozen territories. He looked to be around 40, his face weathered by sun and wind into a map of hard miles. He carried himself with a stillness that was not laziness, not defeat, but a deep and abiding weariness. He looked like a man who had been in motion for a very long time and was searching, simply, for somewhere to stop. He halted his horse a respectful distance from the porch where Elara stood, a heavy iron skillet in her hand. It was not a weapon, but it felt like one. She had learned that solitude bred caution. The man swung down from the saddle. The movement was fluid, economical, the practiced grace of a man who had spent a lifetime on horseback. He did not look at her directly at first, his eyes sweeping over the property with a slow, assessing gaze. She saw him take in the sagging line of the corral fence, the unplowed kitchen garden, the way the paint was peeling from the barn door. His eyes were not judgmental, they were knowing. They were the eyes of a man who understood the physics of decay, the 100 small ways a place could fall apart when there were not enough hands to hold it together. He took off his hat, holding it by the brim. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples. His gaze finally met hers, and she was struck by its directness. There was no artifice in it. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, rough around the edges like old rope. "I'm looking for work." It was a common enough request. Drifters passed through, looking for a season's pay, a few meals before moving on. She had a standard refusal, polite but firm. She had no money for a hired hand. She had no money for much of anything. She watched him, her grip tight on the skillet. She saw the worn leather of his boots, risoled with saddle leather and wire. She saw the way his shoulders slumped just slightly under the weight of his coat, a posture of bone-deep fatigue. He was not a threat. She knew that in her gut, the way she knew the weather, he was just finished, done with the road. "I have nothing to offer," she said, her voice flat. It was the truth. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected it. His eyes moved from her face to the corral, where the mustangs milled and stamped, their wild energy a stark contrast to the quiet neglect of the ranch. They were beautiful animals, powerful and untamed, the last of her father's dreams, and they were worthless to her as they were. He looked back at her. A thought seemed to form behind his steady eyes. "You have those horses," he stated. It was not a question. "They're unbroken," she replied. "I can see that." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Let me stay, and I'll break every horse you've got." The offer hung in the air between them, stark and simple. It was an audacious proposal, the work of a master horseman, offered in exchange for a roof and meals. It was a lifeline she desperately needed. The sale of those horses, properly gentled, would be enough to pay the note on the land, to buy seed for the spring, to see her through another year. It was everything, and her first instinct, born of fear and ingrained caution, was to say no, to send him on his way. A woman alone could not take in a stranger, no matter how capable he seemed. The risk was too great. The town was a full day's ride away. No one would hear her if she screamed. The world was full of men who took advantage of loneliness, who saw a woman's hardship as an opportunity. She opened her mouth, the refusal already formed on her tongue. But she stopped. She looked at him again, really looked. She looked past the worn clothes and the trail dust. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, lines that spoke not of cruelty, but of sorrow. There was a profound quiet in him, a stillness that seemed to absorb the restless wind. He wasn't looking at her with the calculating gaze of a predator. He was looking at her with a kind of shared understanding, a recognition of being at the end of a long, hard road. His honesty was as plain and unadorned as the landscape around them. The desert doesn't lie, her father used to say. It is what it is. This man was the same. He was not pretending to be anything other than what he was, a capable man, worn down by life, asking for a chance to be useful. His gaze flickered for a moment to the small fenced-off plot on the hill. The simple wooden cross was visible from the porch. His eyes softened with something that looked like empathy. He understood. He did not have to be told that she was grieving, that she was alone, that she was in trouble. He had seen it all in the sagging fence and the untended garden. That was what decided it. The unspoken acknowledgement of her struggle. It was a moment of being seen, not as a woman to be exploited, but as a person fighting a hard battle. "The bunkhouse is sound," she said, the words coming out before she could second-guess them. "It's cold, but the roof holds. I can offer meals, and 10% of the sale price for each horse you break." He considered her terms, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a single, decisive nod. "That's fair." He did not ask her name. She did not ask his. It was a practical arrangement, a contract sealed by a shared look across a dusty yard. "I'm Silas," he said, as if remembering a forgotten courtesy. "Alara," she replied. He put his hat back on, the gesture seeming to close the negotiation. He turned to his horse, pulling the saddlebags free. He did not ask for help. He did not seem to expect any. He simply began the work of moving in, his movements deliberate and sure. Alara stood on the porch for a long moment, the heavy skillet still in her hand. The silence of the ranch now occupied by the quiet presence of this stranger. She did not know if she had made a terrible mistake, or if she had just saved herself. She only knew that something had changed. The crushing weight of solitude had shifted, just slightly. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Silas rose before dawn, the soft scrape of his boots on the hard-packed earth the first sound Alara heard each morning. He would draw water from the well, leaving a full bucket on her porch without a word before heading to the corral. He was a man who communicated through action, his competence a language more eloquent than any speech. He started not with the horses, but with the fence. He spent the first 3 days resetting posts, splicing wire, his movements patient and methodical. He worked with a quiet intensity that was mesmerizing to watch. He did not rush. He did not waste a single motion. He was mending her world, one fence post at a time, and in doing so, he was demonstrating his character. A man who mended a fence properly, who ensured the posts were deep and the wire was taut, was a man who understood the importance of foundations. Alara found herself watching him from the kitchen window as she kneaded bread, a strange sense of security settling over her. The ranch felt safer, more solid, simply because he was there. When he was satisfied with the corral, he turned his attention to the mustangs. He did not charge in with rope and spurs. His approach was one of quiet observation. He spent an entire day just sitting on the top rail of the fence, watching them. He learned their hierarchy, their temperaments, the subtle flick of an ear or swish of a tail that spoke of fear or aggression. He was listening to them. The next day he entered the corral. He moved slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller, less threatening. He did not look the lead stallion in the eye. He simply existed in their space, a calm and steady presence, until their panicked snorting subsided into curious watchfulness. It was a slow dance of trust, a negotiation between wildness and patience. Alara had seen men break horses before, with force and fear. This was different. This was a conversation. Their own interactions were just as spare. They ate their meals at the small kitchen table, the space between them filled with a silence that was no longer heavy but companionable. The first few evenings were marked by the simple sounds of cutlery on plates. Then, slowly, words began to find their way into the quiet. "The bay filly has spirit," he said one night, his eyes on his plate. "She'll make a fine saddle horse. My father caught her himself." Alara found herself saying, "Up in the Red Creek Basin." It was a small offering, a piece of her history, and he accepted it with a quiet nod. Another evening, she noticed him rubbing his shoulder. "That roan kicked you," she stated. "He had a right to his opinion," Silas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was the first time she had seen it, and it changed his face, softening the hard lines for a fleeting moment. She learned about him in fragments. He had worked cattle in Texas, run a small ranch in Colorado. He spoke of the land with a deep, abiding respect, but a shadow always crossed his face when he mentioned Colorado. She knew without asking that this was where he had lost what mattered most. One night, as a cold rain drummed against the roof, she dared to ask, "What happened in Colorado?" He was silent for a long time, staring into the flickering flame of the oil lamp on the table. She thought he would not answer. "Fever," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Took my wife, my boy." He said nothing more. He did not need to. The two words held a universe of pain. Alara felt her own grief rise up to meet his, a silent acknowledgement of shared loss. She understood now the source of his deep weariness. He was not just tired from the road. He was tired of outliving his own life. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic facade to the raw hurt beneath. "There's nothing to be done," he said. It was a statement of fact, a truth he had lived with for years. Grief doesn't leave. It just makes room for you to live alongside it. The connection between them deepened in these quiet moments, but it was truly forged in the unspoken gestures that filled their days. He began chopping her firewood, stacking it neatly by the back door, the logs cut to the perfect size for her stove. She began leaving a plate of hot food for him in the warming oven on days when he worked late with a particularly stubborn horse. He repaired the broken hinge on her front gate. She mended a tear in his coat, her stitches small and neat. These were not favors asked for or acknowledged. They were simply acts of care, a quiet conversation happening in parallel to their spoken one. It was the language of two practical wounded people learning to trust again. He saw her strength, her uncomplaining resilience. She saw his integrity, his quiet competence. They were seeing the truth of each other, and in that recognition, a fragile bond began to form. One afternoon, she brought him a canteen of water at the corral. He was working with the bay filly, murmuring to it in a low, soothing voice. The horse, which had been a wild thing of pure terror a week ago, now stood quietly, its head lowered as he ran a hand along its back. It was a testament to his patience, his profound understanding of a frightened animal. He took the canteen from her, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. A jolt, small but unmistakable, passed between them. It was a shock of awareness, a sudden recognition that the space between them was no longer just that of an employer and a hired hand. He looked at her, his eyes dark and searching, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She saw in his gaze a question he would never be bold enough to ask. She turned and walked back to the house, her heart beating a little faster. The quiet ranch no longer felt empty. It felt full of possibility. The first sign of trouble arrived with the dust of a fast-approaching buggy. Jedediah Croft did not believe in slow entrances. He was a man who took up space, his physical bulk matched by a loud, overbearing presence. He owned the largest ranch in the county and held the note on Alara's property, a fact he wielded like a club. He had been circling her land since her father's death, his offers to buy her out becoming more insistent and insulting with each visit. He pulled his horse to a halt in a spray of gravel, nearly running over the small patch of wildflowers Alara had been tending by the porch. He climbed down, his face already flushed with impatience. "Calloway," he boomed, not waiting for a greeting. "I've come about the note. Payment's due in a month. I expect you've come to your senses about my offer." Alara stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She squared her shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "The payment will be made on time, Mr. Croft." Croft laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "With what? Hope and good intentions? Your father, bless his stubborn soul, left you with nothing but a herd of wild broomtails and a mountain of debt. You can't manage this place alone." His eyes swept the yard, And for the first time he noticed the changes. The tidy woodpile, the repaired gate, the taut line of the corral fence. His eyes narrowed, and then he saw Silas walking from the barn with a harness over his shoulder. Croft's gaze flickered from Silas back to Alara, a greasy, knowing smirk spreading across his face. "Well now, I see you've found help." He loaded the word with insinuation. "Getting lonely out here, are we?" The comment was meant to shame her, to reduce her to a desperate woman making a foolish choice. Alara felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks, but before she could speak, Silas had stopped. He was 20 feet away, the harness still slung over his shoulder. He did not move forward. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his presence a sudden, unmovable object in Croft's path of bluster. He looked at Croft with his steady, assessing gaze, the same way he had looked at the wild mustangs, taking his measure, waiting. Croft, accustomed to being the biggest man in any room, was visibly unsettled by Silas's stillness. It was like shouting at a mountain. "Who the hell are you?" Croft demanded, turning his bulk toward Silas. "I work for her," Silas said, his voice calm and even. The simplicity of the statement held more power than any threat. "It was a declaration of allegiance," Croft scoffed. "I'll bet you do. I'm sure the work is rewarding." He winked at Alara, the gesture obscene. Silas took one slow step forward. He still said nothing. He just looked at Croft, and in that look was a quiet promise. It was not a promise of violence, but of consequence. It was the look of a man who had seen real trouble, and was unimpressed by this cheap imitation. He had faced loss that could swallow a man like Croft whole and not even notice. The petty tyranny of a land baron was nothing. Croft's bravado began to curdle. He was a bully, and bullies rely on fear. Silas was not afraid. He was simply there, a wall of quiet integrity. "The note will be paid," Silas said, his voice as flat and hard as the prairie earth. "The horses will be ready for sale in 3 weeks. You'll have your money." It was not a plea or a negotiation. It was a fact. It was the quiet confidence of a man who knew the value of his own labor, who knew what he was capable of. For the first time, Croft seemed to believe it. He saw the competence in Silas, saw the way the ranch was already beginning to heal under his hands, and he knew his opportunity was slipping away. He sputtered for a moment, his face turning a deeper shade of red. He looked from Silas's unyielding face to Alara's defiant one. He had lost. He had been defeated not by force, but by a quiet strength he could not comprehend or intimidate. "You'll regret this, Calloway," he snarled, climbing back into his buggy. "Both of you." He whipped his horse and tore out of the yard, leaving a cloud of angry dust behind him. The silence he left in his wake was profound. The air was thick with unspoken things. Alara looked at Silas, her heart pounding. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat. He had simply stood for her. He had placed himself between her and the ugliness of the world, and he had not flinched. He met her gaze, and the space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a new and powerful current. He had defended her honor, her home, her future. He had claimed his place here, not just as a hired hand, but as a partner in her struggle. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "It's handled." Then he turned and continued walking toward the barn, the harness still over his shoulder, as if he had just paused to swat a fly. But everything was different now. The line between them had been erased. That evening, the quiet at the supper table was different. It was not the comfortable silence of shared work, but the charged silence of a question that had been asked and answered without a single word. After the meal, Alara went out onto the porch, needing the cool night air to calm the tumbling in her chest. The sky was a deep, star-dusted velvet, and the familiar shapes of the barn and the corral were comforting silhouettes against it. Silas followed her out a few minutes later. He did not stand beside her, but leaned against a porch post a few feet away, giving her space. For a long time they just stood there, listening to the night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the distant call of a coyote. "He won't be back," Silas said finally, his voice low. "Not until the note is due." "I know," she said. "Thank you." The words felt small, inadequate for what he had done. He was quiet for a moment. "A man like that," he said, "he feeds on fear. When he can't find any, he starves." They stood in silence again, but it was a silence full of meaning. It was the end of one story and the beginning of another. The business arrangement between them had been fulfilled in that dusty confrontation. What came next was something else entirely. She watched him as he looked out over the land, his land now in a way. His gaze was fixed on the dark outline of the mountains. "This is good land," he said, almost to himself. "It's honest. You give it your best." It gives you a life. He turned his head to look at her, his face shadowed in the faint moonlight. It's a good place to stop running. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew he was not just talking about the ranch. He pushed off from the post and took a step toward her. He stopped when he was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that she could see the deep earnestness in his eyes. "Elara," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth was both strange and wonderful. "I'm not a man with a lot of words, and I have nothing to offer you but my 2 hands and what's left of my life." He paused, and she could see the vulnerability in him, the fear of rejection that even the strongest man could not hide. "What I mean to say is," he struggled, "this place, it feels like home. But a house ain't a home. Not without," he trailed off, but she understood. "I would like to make my home here," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the still night air. "With you if you'll have me." It was not a declaration of flowery passion. It was something far more real, more valuable. It was an offer of partnership, of permanence. It was a proposal built on a foundation of shared work, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding of 2 lonely souls who had found a safe harbor in each other. He was offering to share his future, to mend his broken life alongside hers. She looked at his face, at the man who had shown her his character in 100 small, honest ways. The man who mended fences, gentled horses, and stood against bullies. The man who understood grief and respected strength. She saw not a stranger, but the other half of her own quiet fortitude. The future had always looked to her like a long, solitary road. Now, for the first time, she could see someone walking it beside her. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Yes, Silas, I'd want that." A slow smile spread across his face, the real, unguarded smile she had only glimpsed before. It was like watching the sun rise after a long night. He reached out and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. It was not the hand of a stranger. It was the hand of her husband. 2 years passed. The Wyoming wind still blew, but it no longer seemed to sigh through the ranch with such a raw edge. It was as if the life they had built there had created its own shelter, a small pocket of warmth and purpose against the vast, indifferent landscape. The house had a new coat of whitewash, gleaming in the sun. The fences were arrow straight, enclosing fields of healthy cattle and a new generation of foals that frolicked beside their mothers. The ranch was no longer a place of survival. It was a place of thriving. Silas had broken and sold every one of the Mustangs, just as he had promised. The day he rode back from town with the receipt for the paid-off note from Croft's bank was a quiet day of celebration. They didn't have a party. They simply stood on the porch together, Elara holding the precious piece of paper, and watched the sun set over land that was truly finally theirs. It was a victory that tasted sweeter for how quietly it had been won. They had been married by a traveling preacher the autumn after Silas's proposal. The ceremony was held in the front yard, with the mountains as their witness. Their vows were simple, practical, and honest, much like their love. Now Elara stood on that same porch, a small sleeping bundle wrapped in a blanket in her arms, her son. He had Silas's dark hair and her steady eyes. Silas came up the steps behind her, his boots making a soft, familiar sound on the wood. He wrapped his arms around her and the baby, resting his chin on her shoulder. Together, they looked out at their home. The quiet between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a thing to be shared. It was woven through with memories of hard work, of shared meals, of whispered conversations in the dark. It was the comfortable, easy silence of 2 people who knew each other's hearts without the need for constant words. "He's sleeping soundly," Silas murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "He feels safe," she replied, leaning back against the solid wall of his chest. Watched as a hawk circled high above the fields, its wings catching the golden light of the late afternoon. The land was peaceful, productive. It was a reflection of the life they had built upon it, a life of quiet dignity and mutual care. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Every day," he said. "I was at the end of my rope. I had one more day of riding in me, and then I don't know. I saw this place. I saw it was hurting. And then I saw you." He tightened his arms around her. "I saw you standing on that porch, looking scared but not broken. And I just knew. I knew if you'd let me. This was a place a man could build something again." She turned her head to look at him, her heart full. He was no longer the haunted, weary man who had ridden into her yard. The deep lines of sorrow around his eyes had softened. They were still there, a map of the life he had lived, but now they were joined by new lines, lines of laughter and contentment. He had found his place to stop, and in doing so, he had given her a reason to start again. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then another to the top of their son's head. It was a small gesture, a quiet affirmation of the family they had become. This unlikely trio, brought together by hardship and held together by a love as steady and enduring as the mountains on the horizon. There is a kind of courage that is not loud. It does not announce itself with trumpets or fanfare. It is the quiet, stubborn courage of a single fence post, holding its line against the wind. It is the courage to wake up each morning in a silent house and face the day's work alone. It is the courage to look a stranger in the eye and see not a threat, but a reflection of your own lonely soul. The greatest things in this life are often built on a foundation of quiet integrity. A home is not just wood and nails, but a shared space of respect. A family is not just blood, but a bond forged in the crucible of shared struggle and silent, steadfast care. Love, the truest kind, is often not found in a fiery passion, but in the slow, deliberate work of two people mending the broken pieces of their lives together, side by side. The hardest thing a person can do is to stop running, to turn and face the emptiness and decide to build something new in its place. And sometimes, all it takes is a simple offer, an honest day's work, and the quiet promise of a man who looks at a herd of unbroken horses and sees not a problem, but a future. It is the courage to say yes to a second chance, and in doing so, to discover that the home you were searching for was waiting for you all along, right there on your own front porch.